It was very surprising to me that after disclosing to everyone that I'm no longer a believer in God, that virtually no one asked me why. Not amongst friends, family, or acquaintances. This was surprising to me as I had lived a very religious life up until this point. I mean, I've even entered the ministry to be a pastor. So how is it that not even one person had asked me why this great change had taken place in my life? Well, I soon came to realize that this was because people had already made their own decisions, and for the most part, this decision consisted of the opinion that I had been turned off, that there had been too many negative experiences and I simply rejected church and God altogether. This is completely untrue. But what furthermore surprised me was that no matter how much I tried to explain, sometimes virtually pleading, that my memories of church are actually fond ones, people still seemed to continue to hold on to the same explanation, that I had been turned off. My next big surprise came from other Christians who never knew me. The common line of reasoning that I got there was that I was never actually a true Christian, that I was never truly saved. For if I was, they would argue, I would never have made this decision to leave God. This too is untrue. I had a very intense and powerful relationship with Christ, meditating with Him, worshiping His praises, and simply speaking with Him throughout each day of my life. My leaving the church is based exclusively on rational and logical judgment and the discovery of so much consistent indication and coherent evidence, all of which I'm about to show you in this project. That is why I've decided to create this video, gathering my thoughts and memories together and recording the step-by-step process of my gradual transformation into a non-believer. It is my sincere belief that this video will help people not only understand why I have left the church, but will help those that are struggling with their own faith embrace reality and reason when making their decisions. Here's what I call my spiritual awakening. I was born to a religious mother and a drunken, very abusive father. My father left us when I was about 4 years old, leaving just me and my mother. Fate took a devastating turn shortly afterwards. When I was 6 years old, my mother was jaywalking across a busy street and got struck by a car and died instantly. It was my most difficult time. I was then taken under the wing of my aunt and uncle, being my mother's sister and her husband. My aunt was a devoutly religious person, and she would continually pray with me, hold me, and give me assurances that I would one day see my mother again. I remember at the funeral of my mother, I had placed a rose in her hand. My aunt would always tell me that one day Jesus would return, and my mother would awaken and smell the rose I placed in her hand, and rush to see me and hold me once again. I had thought of this so many times throughout childhood, and many days I would cry. And throughout this entire hardship, my church family always stuck by me and always took good care of me. It was a wonderful thing. As I got into my teens, I had begun to rebel. Me and my friends would skip class all the time to do, well, bad things, and I had begun to flunk out. I eventually dropped out of high school and was at a point in my life where I wasn't sure what to do. But despite this rebellious period of time in my life, I never let go of God's hand. I would pray to Him all the time. My most common prayers were asking for forgiveness for my actions, thanking Him for dying for these sins of mine, and asking for the strength to change. I remember many a night where I lay drunk and in tears, crying to the Lord to help me change. This remained my overall teenage life. Then one summer day, while in my early 20s, our church had a special guest speaker. He was an evangelist who was coming through town, and he would be stopping at our church. This was very exciting to many people. That Sabbath day I listened to him speak and came up with what I thought was an amazing idea. You see, the war in the Balkans was at its peak at that time. My family is from the Balkans. And I came up with an idea to have an evangelism for Serbs and Croats, asking the question who was going to win the war. I felt this would bring many people to the meeting, and the obvious outcome would be that God would be the one to ultimately win the war. I decided to share this idea with the visiting evangelist. After the sermon, I went to the minister and asked if I could have a short discussion with him. He agreed, and we went to the church balcony to talk. There I told him my idea, thinking he would get just as excited. Well, he didn't dismiss my idea, but he told me something that changed my life forever. He said to me, "Mike, you should be a pastor." A tiny seed was planted that day in church, and it grew rapidly. By the day's end, I had known that God was calling me. It suddenly dawned on me. God had wanted me to be a minister of the faith. God wanted me to join the front lines of the battle between good and evil as His mighty servant. This is why He gave me that idea on that day, so that this evangelist would be there to deliver to me God's calling. I won't get into the details of my calling, as it is quite lengthy, but to make a long story short, by the end of that summer, I had completed my high school equivalency test, the GED, and was packed up in my 1978 Volkswagen Rabbit and on my way to the ministry, a 3-day drive from home. I was enrolled in university to be a minister of the faith. I remember my first day at the school. It was far away from home, and I didn't know a single soul out there. The university was tucked away in a picturesque setting of hills and nature. It was very beautiful. I unpacked into my dorm room and took a shower and a shave. I got dressed and decided to take a walk around the campus. I came to one particular section of the campus, looking over a field, and I stopped to pray. I remember thinking to myself that I am in the training camp of the Lord, and that I have taken on that noble charge to be a frontline soldier for Jesus in the great battle between good and evil. I prayed to the Lord to be with me and help me serve Him as He wishes, to give me the strength I need for my upcoming battles and challenges. It was indeed a very profound moment for me. I spent only 2 years at the school. I did terrible in my studies. I didn't know it then, but I have a very strong case of ADHD, and that was the main reason I could never study effectively or retain information I read. Incidentally, my ADD is very much under control today. During those 2 years, I made some good friends and shared some wonderful times. I would often play the piano in the auditorium and frequently accompanied various singers. This felt very good to me. Among the most moving moments for me was when we would all sing together. Such a large number of us young people singing praises to our God was such a wonderful feeling that at times it was breathtaking. My personal favorite was the song, "Sing Hallelujah to the Lord." Very powerful indeed. Everywhere I went, even outside of the school, I would always speak with others, witnessing the truth of Jesus Christ. My most beloved experiences in witnessing were when someone would tell me that they had done so many bad things in their life that God could never forgive them, or that they simply didn't deserve salvation. I would explain to them that the wages of sin is death, yes, and therefore anyone who has sinned is condemned to death, which is absolutely every last one of us. But Jesus Christ died that death that we are condemned to, and that all we have to do is accept Him as our Lord and personal Savior, and our sins are washed away. All we have to do is come to Him with our sins, and His grace will render our souls clean, regardless of what things we have done in the past. Yes, I had the blessed assurance that I was saved through the grace of Jesus Christ, and it was a glorious feeling. When I had returned home to Toronto 2 years later, I had felt very much that I was going to return to my studies and be a minister of the faith. I had no money to continue with my studies, but that was merely a stumbling block, and I would be able to return within 1 year. It was around this time that I had decided to do something about a certain issue that troubled me greatly, to take on a particular project. You see, while I was at the ministry, I would repeatedly hear upsetting comments about Ellen G. White. Ellen White is believed to be a prophetess of the Lord by Seventh-day Adventists, and I had believed in her unreservedly. There were a rising number of people that were arguing that Ellen G. White was a plagiarist, and this distressed me to say the least. There were even books written about her plagiarism, most notably The White Lie, by none other than a former Seventh-day Adventist pastor. The devil was working very gruelingly against the Lord, I was sure. Well, I had decided that I would prove them wrong. I was resolute to write a book of my own, discrediting these hate-mongers. I thought to myself, perhaps this is why God wanted me to take time off my studies. Perhaps it was his mission for me to show the world that these accusations were nothing more than hatred material. I was strong-willed and unwavering as I began my sanctified assignment. My pursuit took me on a roller coaster ride, to say the least. I read so many different things and surfed so many different websites that I could hardly keep count. I saw what people were saying on both sides. I equally looked through the information of people that say Ellen White was a plagiarist, as well as the information of people that defend her, including the many writings of the Ellen G. White estates and several other defenders, most notably Herbert E. Douglas in his acclaimed book, Messenger of the Lord. The answers I found rocked the very foundation of what I had so strongly believed all of my entire life. It took the entire world that I had been part of and turned it upside down. Here is what I found. For starters, let me say that Ellen G. White was a plagiarist. To dispute this statement, I find, if you've done the research, is completely ludicrous. The people I've argued with over this topic have never actually read the material side by side with the other books in question. However, if you read them side by side, I don't know how anyone can come up with another explanation. There are so many large sections of her writings that were supposedly given to her by the Lord in vision that are complete replicas, only paraphrased, of other books written long before her. The Adventist Church will defend her by saying that she only borrowed information from other books, and that the total borrowing in all her writings totals only 20-some-odd% if my memory serves me correctly. Inasmuch as that may be, what they don't tell you is that very large portions of many of her writings are purportedly borrowed, and the 20-something% is then a ratio to all her writings as a whole, and she wrote many books. What's more, these borrowings are not copied verbatim and properly footnoted, rather they are paraphrased, leading me to conclude nothing more than plagiarism. If you are a believer in Ellen White, I challenge you to read the material in question side by side. Adventists will also defend her by bringing into account the review of her work regarding plagiarism by attorney Vincent L. Ramick of the law firm of Diller, Ramick & White. In his 1981 report, he concluded that, and I quote, Ellen G. White was not a plagiarist, and her works did not constitute copyright infringement/privacy. Considering that Ramick was not an Adventist, this seems to be a very strong argument. However, Ramick does state that Mrs. White modified, exalted, and improved the writings of others in an ethical as well as legal manner. He goes on to say that she stayed well within the legal boundaries of fair use. From my perspective, this may be a solid argument that she stayed within those legal boundaries of fair use, and therefore couldn't be legally labeled a plagiarist, but doesn't in any way suggest she didn't actually copy information from other books. In fact, it states the opposite. But may I ask the real question here? If those words came to her from God in vision, why would Almighty God himself need to borrow the writings of others? Why would God need to use the legal ambiguity of fair use when bringing words to the paper? To this very day, fair use is a heavily debated legal position, with vagueness and indistinctness to say the least. Additionally, why hasn't the Seventh-day Adventist Church ever even discussed this idea of Ellen White borrowing information until it was made public by the notoriety of such publications as The White Lie? This movie is not created to dispute or contest Ellen G. White, but about my gradual growth from believer to non-believer, so I'm not going to get into all the details or show examples of the actual writings, as this would take a very, very long time. But if you want to dispute this fact, then you need to do your own research first. I do recommend that infamous book, The White Lie, and in contrast, I recommend reading the Ellen G. White Estate's response to The White Lie on their website. If you want to read them side by side, the books she paraphrased from can still be bought to this day on Amazon.com, such as Night Scenes in the Bible by Daniel March, or Paradise Lost by John Milton, or various works by Alfred Edersheim, such as The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. But my roller coaster ride didn't end with plagiarism. In fact, it got significantly worse. You see, I set out to prove that Ellen White was not a plagiarist. I had no idea I was going to discover so much more. False prophecies and absolutely ridiculous statements, and so many of them. Here's only a handful of some things I found. In early writings, page 75, she wrote, Then I was appointed to some who are in the great error of believing that this is their duty to go to Old Jerusalem, and think that they have work to do before the Lord comes. I saw that Satan had greatly deceived some in this thing. I also saw that Old Jerusalem would never be built up. Perhaps her calculation that there would be people with the duty to go to Old Jerusalem was a good one. But the exact opposite of Ellen White's prediction has happened. Since 1948, when Israel became a nation, Old Jerusalem was greatly built up and is a standing, functioning city today. She predicted on several occasions that Christ would return in her lifetime. Soon our eyes were drawn to the east, for a small black cloud had appeared, about half as large as a man's hand, which we all knew was the sign of the Son of Man. The graves opened, and in the same moment we were changed and caught up together with them to meet the Lord in the air. Mrs. White was not with the living saints, and this did not happen. Rather than being caught up with the living saints, Mrs. White died on July 16, 1915. In early writings in the 1850s, she urged new converts that they only had a few months before the return of Christ. But now time is almost finished, and what we have been years learning, they will have to learn in a few months. In May 1856, at a church meeting in Battle Creek, Michigan, Mrs. White boldly stated, "I saw that some of those present would be food for worms, some subjects for the 7 last plagues, and some would be translated to heaven at the second coming of Christ without seeing death." As former Seventh-day Adventist pastor Sidney Cleveland said, in biblical times she would have been stoned to death for being a false prophet. These are only a few of so many false prophecies. I simply had no idea that she said all of these things. And remember, these supposedly came to her in vision from God. Again, the purpose of this movie is not to give you a long list of false prophecies by Ellen White, so I'll stop here. But if you would like to see many more of her false prophecies, I recommend the website ellenwhiteexposed.com, and in contrast the book defending her, Messenger of the Lord by Herbert Douglas. Believe it or not, the roller coaster ride didn't stop here. There were also many writings that were so ludicrous that it boggled my mind that anyone could possibly accept her as a genuine prophet. These too are many. For example, probably the most notoriously discussed topic she wrote about was masturbation, which she called self-indulgence or a solitary vice. In her book, A Solemn Appeal, she writes that masturbation in men causes liver and lung infection, neuralgia, rheumatism, affection of the spine, diseased kidneys, and even cancerous tumors. In females, however, the results are various diseases such as catarrh, dropsy, headache, loss of memory and sight, great weakness in the back and loins, affections of the spine, and, frequently, inward decay of the head. Cancerous tumor, which she said would lie dormant in the system their lifetime, is inflamed and commences its eating destructive work. The mind is often utterly ruined and insanity supervenes. Not only is all of this scientifically incorrect, it is completely outlandish, bizarre, and just plain ridiculous. But what's strikingly more is what brings us back to the original discussion of plagiarism. These were the very same lists published by Horace Mann, an educational reformist, and Larkin B. Coles in his Philosophy of Health. To accept Ellen White as a prophet, that would mean that we would believe these scientifically inaccurate views were given to her by God, and they just so happen to, ever so coincidentally, be a spot-on match to the writings of these two men. I mean, seriously? The well-known vision she had in front of Joseph Bates, she claimed to visit Jupiter and Saturn and gave account of the moons. Interestingly, these were only the moons that were known to exist at the time. In Messenger of the Lord, Herbert Douglas states, obviously what Bates heard corresponded to his knowledge of what telescopes showed in 1846. Almost certainly this vision was given in Bates' presence to give him added confidence in Ellen White's ministry. If she had mentioned the number of moons that modern telescopes reveal, it seems clear that Bates' doubts would have been confirmed. I'm sorry, but are you kidding me? The best defense here is that God asked Mrs. White to lie, as Bates would have probably been in doubt? Are you telling me it wouldn't have been more effective if she said that our world knows of this many moons, but time will show there are more? This is a horribly weak argument. There are so many more preposterous statements. Again, I won't get into them. But I want to discuss one more. my all-time favorite absurdity. It is her writings on the races of humans in Spiritual Gifts, Volume 3, pages 64 and 75, where she claims that the various races of humans is due to copulation of men and animals, which she called amalgamation, and I will address Herbert Douglas's response momentarily. On page 75 she writes, "Every species of animal which God had created were preserved in the ark. The confused species which God did not create, which were the result of amalgamation, were destroyed by the flood. Since the flood, there has been amalgamation of man and beast, as may be seen in the almost endless varieties of species of animals and in certain races of men." On page 64 she writes, "But if there was one sin above another which called for the destruction of the race by the flood, it was the base crime of amalgamation of man and beast, which defaced the image of God and caused confusion everywhere. God proposed to destroy by a flood that powerful, long-lived race that had corrupted their ways before him." I will be honest, when I first got the book Messenger of the Lord, the one I mentioned is to defend Mrs. White by Herbert Douglas, the first thing I looked up was this topic. I wanted to see how anyone could ever possibly defend such an insensible farce of a testimonial. Douglas's defense began by stating that no dictionary defines amalgamation as sexual intercourse between human and animal. Well, that's just weak. Let's see what the dictionary at the time did say. According to Webster's, there were only two definitions. The first one is the same one today, which is for metallurgy and the mixing of metals. The second definition states simply, the mixing of any two things. Well, we know Ellen White couldn't have meant the mixing of metals, so the only other possible definition is the mixing of two things. In other words, the mixing of man and beast. If she didn't mean the sexual mixing of man and beast, what kind of mixing could she possibly have meant? I mean, if you had to paraphrase the statement, the amalgamation of man and beast, what in the world would you say? But more importantly, in my opinion, let's take into consideration the usage of the word in the 1800s. According to the American Historical Review, the word amalgamation had been in use as a general term for ethnic and racial intermixing. According to Princeton University, laws banning race mixing were enforced in Nazi Germany from 1935 until 1945, in certain U.S. states from the colonial era until 1967, and in South Africa during the early part of the apartheid era. All these laws primarily banned marriage between spouses of different racially or ethnically defined groups, which was termed amalgamation. According to mixedracestudies.org, amalgamation is a now largely archaic term for the intermarriage and interbreeding of different ethnicities or races. In the English-speaking world, the term was in use into the 20th century. In the United States, it was partly replaced after 1863 by the term miscegenation. The term amalgamation referred specifically to the interbreeding of whites and non-whites, especially African Americans. And this is only scratching the surface. In fact, I had no problem whatsoever finding endless examples of the word amalgamation to refer to the interbreeding of races from that time. They came up in numerous documents, numerous criminal codes, numerous examples in classic literature. They are everywhere. Make no mistake about it, this was a commonly used sociological word indeed. Additionally, we know that Ellen White was actively involved in racial issues of the time. She actually fought for the equality of the races. In fact, to use the words of Benjamin Baker, author of Crucial Moments, 12 Defining Events in Black Adventist History, she was relentless with letters, speeches. She raised money for the black work. We also know that her son, James Edson, was an unyielding pioneer with his missions to African Americans and built up to 50 schools for black people. Taking into account the definition of the word amalgamation, the usage of the word amalgamation in her time, that Ellen White was clearly a fluent wordsmith, the judicial wordings for the mixing of the races, and her family's active role in these subject matters. To suggest she meant something else with the word amalgamation, in my opinion, is one of the longest grasps for straws I have ever seen in my entire life. Douglas dared to even go as far as saying, "The burden of proof rests on those who affirm that Mrs. White gave a new and alien meaning to the term. No, sir, not at all. It's in fact you, Mr. Douglas, that is making an attempt to give the term a new and alien meaning, a meaning that you never actually clearly state. What definition would you suggest she meant by amalgamation of man and beast?" Douglas further argues that it is not certain that she meant of man and beast or of man and of beast. Well, this just leaves us with a bundle of confusion, doesn't it? What's he saying? That amalgamation of different races led to even more races? Or that animals had interspecies sex and that created new species of animals? But let's not forget that on page 64 her statement starts with, "But if there was one sin above another, which called for the destruction of the race by the flood, it was the base crime of amalgamation of man and beast which defaced the image of God." In other words, this was the single greatest sin that caused God to destroy the world. But wouldn't that mean that interracial marriages are equally so exceedingly wicked and immoral today as they were then? At this point I questioned, how can anyone think this woman is not a false prophet? This became an outrage to me. Suddenly, so many of her writings seemed so absurd to me, like when she visited Enoch on a distant planet, or when she saw the remarkably tall and elevated inhabitants of Jupiter. I marveled how I ever believed any of this drivel. It was simply impossible for me to believe in Ellen White as a prophet any longer. As a result, believing Seventh-day Adventism was the true faith was all but gone. After all, so many of the Church's teachings are based on her writings, even though the Church will tell you that this is untrue. My world had become unraveled. Yes, the very foundation of my belief system was now shattered. I was so confused. I prayed to God. I prayed to help me understand what His truth is. I begged the Lord to show me where I needed to go next. I prayed that He lead me to His true faith. I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. Inasmuch as my world had been turned upside down at this point, I was determined to follow God and have Him lead me to wherever His truth may lie. I began the most important quest of my life. But now, my mind began to unravel the chains that held it fixed to one thought. I've never questioned my beliefs before, and there was never anything anyone could ever say to me that would cause me to drift from my beliefs. I now realize that this was terribly unfair. It is unfair to dismiss every single line of reasoning anyone ever gives you. But that's what we all do as Christians, isn't it? We won't accept a single thing anyone tells us. We won't even allow ourselves to simply consider any line of reasoning. This is not only unfair, but is, in my opinion, bigoted. But now that my brain had been freed of the tether of all things that I thought I knew since childhood, it's amazing how much your mind will start to look at things differently, with impartiality, unbiased and rational. Things that seemed rather silly before, now were very serious questions. I remember thinking how ridiculous it was to ask the question, why doesn't God heal amputees? But now this was a genuine and thought-provoking question, not ridiculous at all. I questioned, why does God only heal invisible diseases, namely cancer? Whenever someone in our church family acquired that dreaded disease, we would all have long sessions of group prayer so God could heal this person, and sometimes it seemed He would. But here's the thing. The sudden eradication of cancer has been going on since the discovery of the illness to believers and non-believers alike. So if someone's cancer is now gone, how do we know it truly is a miracle? And if God heals people with cancer, why not the visible diseases like multiple sclerosis or paraplegics? I mean, if someone lost an arm in a terrible accident and then it grew back after group prayer, well then we would have a genuine, indisputable miracle. Or if someone with advanced MS suddenly walked and talked normally all over again, there's another miracle. But these things absolutely never happen. Does this mean that God loves people with invisible diseases more than people with visible ones? Or does it simply mean He doesn't heal anyone? I also remember feeling guilty for laughing at George Carlin's famous stand-up session where he mocked the concept of prayer. He questioned what happens when a prayer isn't answered. The obvious answer is that it is God's will. He then asked, if God is going to do His will anyway, what's the point of praying in the first place? Well, once this was a comedy sketch to me and nothing more, but now it was a critical inquiry. Really, how does prayer work when you consider it this way? Or perhaps it was the simplest answer, that it doesn't. Another paradox I began to question was the concept of evangelism, or even just witnessing. What happens when someone lives their life without ever hearing the truth, whatever you perceive that truth to be? Will they be condemned to hell or to death? One of the fundamental beliefs of Christianity states that this person will not lose salvation because God will not judge a person by what they do not know. Well, if this is true, then the only measurable results our witnessing will accomplish is the permanent death of some people. I mean, think about it. If we witness to many people, some of those people will reject the message and ultimately reject their salvation. But if we don't witness or evangelize at all, far less people will have the opportunity to reject the message, and therefore many more people will be saved. These are only a few of the many puzzles I encountered in my pursuit. But still I would not reject God. This only meant that the quest to find His truth is that much more challenging. I had to search high and low to find answers. I felt God was stimulating me into seeking Him out and finding the mystifying answers that embodies Him. I now knew I had to look everywhere. My search led me to many different schools of thought, some intellectually thought-provoking, while some just plain silly. The line of reasoning, however, that most continuously popped its ugly head was evolution by natural selection, but I would have nothing to do with that. The only problem was that everywhere I looked, there was something leading me away from God, the God of the Bible anyway. Ah yes, the Bible, the infallible Word of God. Many things that I took as fact in the Bible I suddenly found out were not. For example, I found out that there is no evidence that the Jews were ever enslaved by the ancient Egyptians, or that they ever wandered the desert for 40 years. Huh? I can honestly say that I always thought this was documented historically outside of the Bible. Well, it turns out that it's not. One has to wonder how it is possible that such an enormous multitude of people would be enslaved for so many years and then live in a desert area for 40 entire years without leaving behind any archaeological or historical evidence whatsoever. None. Or is it possible that it just never happened? I really began to wonder. The Bible began showing me its true colors. The contradictions I once thought were non-existent started popping up all over the place. In Genesis chapter 1, God created both Adam and Eve at the same time. But in the second chapter, the story is retold that God created Adam first and then Eve later. In Genesis 2 verse 7 and 2:19, God created man and then the animals. But in Genesis 1, 24 through 27, He created the animals first and then man. In Genesis 32:30 and Numbers 14:14, it clearly states that men have seen God, whereas in John 1:18 it states that no man has seen God. In Jeremiah 3 verse 12, it says that God doesn't keep anger forever, whereas later in the book, in Jeremiah 17 verse 4, it says that He does. In Matthew 1 verse 20, the angel appeared to Joseph, whereas in the Gospel of Luke 1:28, the angel appeared to Mary. In Matthew 8 verse 5, the centurion came to Jesus, but in Luke 7 verse 3, he sent his elders. In Matthew 4, 5 through 8, Satan took Jesus to the temple and then to the mountain. In Luke 4, 5 through 9, he took Jesus to the mountain and then the temple. In Matthew 20:29, 2 blind men were healed on the road, whereas in Mark 10, 46 and 47, it was only 1. Now, these may all seem like honest little mistakes, but as far as I'm concerned, there are no honest little mistakes when channeled by a divine being. And this is only a small list of the continuous contradictions throughout the entire book. It was becoming increasingly difficult to accept the Bible as the word of an omnipotent being. Also, some stories in the Bible were now becoming harder to come to terms with. For the first time in my life, I questioned the talking snake in the Garden of Eden, and then the idea that Adam and Eve and their children practiced incest to populate the world. Take for example as well the story of Noah's Ark. The argument I heard was so obvious and so evident that I wondered why I never thought of these things myself. The contentions I heard from science writer Michael Shermer is that it is impossible to believe that all 10 billion species were somehow housed in this single boat. And what about specialized diets of so many animals, like bamboo shoots for pandas, or eucalyptus for the koala bear? What about the predator and prey situation? What about managing the outrageous amount of animal waste, and that out of one window? And then afterwards, these animals were all distributed appropriately, where all the marsupials are in Australia, the Arctic wolves went to the North American Arctic Circle, etc. Furthermore, why is there no geological evidence of any sort? And if the Ark landed on Mount Ararat, why hasn't it ever been found? I've heard many people say that it has, but that simply isn't so. The story came across to me so incredibly ridiculous that I wondered how I ever believed it in the first place. To quote Michael Shermer, "This story is so ridiculous that I find it embarrassing to people that try to defend this." And speaking of Noah's Ark, I was shocked when I was shown the parallels of biblical stories with mythological stories written long before. The story of Gilgamesh, known to have been written over 1,000 years before Moses, the supposed writer of Genesis, is a near replica of the story of Noah's Ark. God decided to send a worldwide flood that would drown all the men, women, children, and infants, as well as eliminate all of the land animals and birds. But God knew of one righteous man, Ut-Napishtim. God ordered this hero to build a multi-story wooden ark. Ut-Napishtim initially complained about the assignment to build the boat. The ark would have many compartments, a single door, be sealed with pitch, and would house each of every animal species. A great rain covered the land with water, and the ark landed on a mountain in the Middle East. But the similarities of the story of Gilgamesh don't end there. Birds were sent out, and the first 2 birds returned to the ark, while the 3rd bird apparently found dry land because it did not return. We know that the story of Gilgamesh came from Babylon around 2500 BCE, which is about 1,200 years before Moses, according to rabbinical Judaism. Can we honestly think, based on these similarities, that those who ever wrote the story of Genesis, whether it be Moses or whomever, had not heard the Gilgamesh story? And if they had heard it and they were simply rehashing an old, very popular tale, what does this say about the Bible? The thing is, there are many more of these stories, such as Jonah and the whale and Jason from Greek mythology. They go on and on. But what was most shocking to me is the story of Jesus. I did not want to believe it myself, but the story of Jesus is an observable revision of numerous previous characters. As it turns out, it's not even vaguely original. Here are some examples that I copied from danielmessler.com. Remember, these examples are of characters written hundreds of years before Jesus was said to walk the earth. Asclepios healed the sick, raised the dead, and was known as the Savior and Redeemer. Hercules was born of a divine father and mortal mother, and was known as the Savior of the world. Prophets foretold his birth and claimed he would be a king, which started a search by a leader who wanted to kill him. He walked on water and told his mother, "Don't cry, I'm going to heaven." When he died, as he passed, he said, "It is finished." Dionysus was literally the Son of God, was born of a virgin mother, and was commonly depicted riding a donkey. He healed the sick and turned water to wine. He was killed but was resurrected and became immortal. It is said that his greatest accomplishment was his own death, which delivers humanity itself. Osiris did the same things. He was born of a virgin, was considered the first true king of the people, and when he died he rose from the grave and went to heaven. Osiris' son, Horus, was known as the light of the world, the good shepherd, and the lamb. He was also referred to as the way, the truth, and the life. His symbol was a cross. He was born of a virgin and was the only begotten son of the god Osiris. His birth was heralded by a star, and the ancient Egyptians paraded a child in a manger representing Horus through the streets at the time of the winter solstice, around December 21st. There was a death threat when he was a baby by Herod, who tried to have Horus murdered. The threat was handled by the god that tells Horus's mother, "Come, thou goddess Isis, hide thyself with thy child." There was a break in life history. There is no data between the ages of 12 and 30, and at 30 he was baptized. The fate of his baptizer was beheading. He walked on water, cast out demons, healed the sick, and restored sight to the blind. He was eventually crucified, but in 3 days was resurrected. Mithra's birthday was celebrated on the 25th of December. His birthday was witnessed by local shepherds who brought him gifts, had 12 disciples, and when he was done on earth, he had a final meal before going up to heaven. On Judgment Day he'll return to pass judgment on the living and the dead. The good will go to heaven, and the evil will die in a giant fire. His holiday is on Sunday. He's the sun god. His followers called themselves brothers, and their leaders fathers. They had baptism and a meal ritual where symbolic flesh and blood were eaten. Krishna had a miraculous conception that wise men were able to come to because they were guided by a star. After he was born, an area ruler tried to have him found and killed. His parents were warned by a divine messenger, however, and they escaped and were met by shepherds. The boy grew up to be the mediator between God and man. Buddha's mother was told by an angel that she'd give birth to a holy child destined to be a savior. As a child, he teaches the priests in his temple about religion while his parents look for him. He starts his religious career at roughly 30 years of age and is said to have spoken to 12 disciples on his deathbed. One of the disciples is his favorite, and another is a traitor. He and his disciples abstain from wealth and travel around speaking in parables and metaphors. He called himself the Son of Man and was referred to as Prophet, Master, and Lord. He healed the sick, cured the blind and deaf, and he walked on water. Believe it or not, but this list does not stop here and goes on. In my quest, I was also emailing with an Orthodox Jew who claimed that Jesus of Nazareth was simply one of them and was a great teacher of Hillel the Elder, one of the men that wrote the Talmud. He explained that the time of Jesus was the most corrupt period of time in Judaism, and that the leaders of the Sanhedrin were strongly opposed to Hillel and were persecuting his followers. He gave examples of the similarities of Jesus' teachings with that of Hillel the Elder, such as, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you," also found in the Talmud, written long before Jesus. He explained his belief that, inasmuch as Jesus was crucified, it was certainly not as big an event as the Gospels would have you believe. He reminded me that the most prolific writers of that region of the world, in the time, were right there in Rome and Jerusalem, and that if such great political events took place, such as lobbying the Emperor of Rome himself, wouldn't there be so many more writings to be found outside of the Bible? I asked, but why did the story of Jesus prevail and become so substantial? He reasoned that these kinds of things happen in humanity all the time. When the World Wide Web, for example, became prominent, there were countless bookstores online, but somehow Amazon.com became the prevailing site. There were also numerous auction sites, but somehow eBay won that war and assumed dominion. We don't know how these things happen, but they do. The story of Jesus of Nazareth was the prevailing story that continued through the ages to this day. I had simply heard enough. My heart was actually broken. A depression was looming my way. With all that I found, how could I possibly continue to believe in the Bible? What could possibly compel me to accept this book as divine? And with all this evidence before me, how could I possibly accept that Jesus was the Son of God? Most biblical theologians will tell you that we don't really know who wrote the Bible. There are other Gospels that we are just now hearing about that didn't make the Bible. The Bible is flashing red lights all over it, that it is a human-edited, socially constructed collection of books over many, many centuries. I could not believe where my quest had taken me. Despite this morbid sorrow that had now embodied my life, there was something that I knew for sure. Even if the God of Abraham, meaning Christian, Jew, and Muslim, was not real, I was still convinced God was out there. The infinite complexities of the universe and that of life itself could not have simply evolved. They had to have had a designer. Additionally, what about love and morality? How can these two pillar entities of humanity be without a supernatural creator? The idea to me was ludicrous. Yes, despite this menacing depression that had now come on to me, I was unwavering, more committed than ever before, to continue my search to the end.
Was blind, but now I see.
My pursuit first took me to find scientific proof of God's existence through the school of thought known as intelligent design. Ironically, this search would continuously bring in that ugly head again, evolution by natural selection. Intelligent design's strongest line of reasoning, in my opinion, was that of irreducible complexity. Irreducible complexity is, as defined by biochemist Michael Maletin, A single system which is composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. He uses the analogy of a mousetrap to illustrate this concept. A mousetrap consists of several interacting pieces, the base, the catch, the spring, and the hammer, all of which must be in place for the mousetrap to work. Removal of any one piece destroys the function of the mousetrap. Intelligent design advocates assert that natural selection could not create irreducibly complex systems, because the selectable function is present only when all parts are assembled. To me, this seemed like a very resilient argument. The only problem was that it was constantly proved wrong. For example, one of the most often used examples of irreducible complexity is that of the human eye, with all of its numerous components. Removal of any one of these would render the eye unworkable, and therefore the theory of irreducible complexity must apply. If this were true, however, then we would not have examples like the single-celled euglena, which have evolved antennae for light, or the mollusks and jellyfish, which have evolved varying grades of vision. Plus, consider this. The human eye is more poorly constructed and much less acute than the eyes of many creatures, such as the octopus or the great horned owl. Did God care more about the supposed design of the octopus than he did of his own children? Or is it possible that these creatures needed this better vision to survive, and so evolved this way? The arguments for and against intelligent design are too numerous to list here. But if you're interested in learning more, I strongly recommend two documentaries that make an account of the famous trial for intelligent design, known as Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District. They are A War on Science, presented by the BBC, and Judgment Day, Intelligent Design on Trial, presented by the PBS. All of this was sounding to me very much like the God of the Gaps argument. This is an argument which is a type of theological perspective in which gaps in scientific knowledge are taken to be evidence or proof of God's existence. A good analogy, I feel, was a man I once knew who emigrated from Bosnia in the peak of the Balkan Wars. He couldn't wrap his head around why houses in the West fluctuate so much in price and are consistently on the rise. I tried to explain to him the economic concept of when times are good, people are more willing to buy homes and are willing to spend more money on them. And as the population grows, so do home prices. He argued back, saying that the only possible explanation is that there is a small group of wealthy men that control these prices. I was taken aback. Are you kidding me? I would contend. It's not like that at all. I tried explaining how during prosperous times there is much production, and when the economy is red hot there is hyperproduction, possibly causing a recession, and so on and so forth. As I went on about all this, I realized that this is actually pretty complex stuff. We here are used to it as it has been part of our lives throughout, but when trying to explain it, you realize that it really is quite multifaceted and complex. He, however, simply wouldn't accept it and told me that I'm being naive. He told me that I am believing what this small group of wealthy men want me to believe. No matter how much we squabbled on this matter, there was nothing I could say to convince him otherwise. To me, this is the same thing with the God of the Gaps argument. The universe and life itself is seemingly infinitely complex, so much so that it can be overwhelming to even the brightest of minds. So we say, God created all this. And when some people start to unravel some of the intricacies of the universe and life itself, we say you're being naive. Science can't prove everything. God created everything. We push the easy button, the God button. Additional to all this, that ugly head of evolution by natural selection started to show itself everywhere I turned. It was frustrating. The example I like to give the most, the one that turns the most heads, is when I saw a documentary on cable TV about the female orgasm. Yes, the female orgasm is more proof of evolution by natural selection. Bear with me and you'll see. The documentary was all about the difficulties of women achieving orgasm. In fact, according to ABC News, research suggests that about 75% of all women never reach orgasm from intercourse alone, and that 10 to 15% never climax under any circumstances. Men, on the other hand, for the most part, can orgasm on a dime. In fact, most men will tell you that it's not about achieving orgasm that's the problem, but inhibiting its arrival. So how does this suggest evolution by natural selection? Well, consider if men had this same problem, the same statistics as women. It goes to reason that many generations from now, we would be in the exact same spot as we are now, where men can do it on a dime and women remain unchanged. Why? Because men have to orgasm in order to procreate, whereas women do not. So men that were unable to orgasm during intercourse, well, their genes would quickly die off. Men that had difficulty achieving orgasm, well, their genes would maybe stick around a bit longer, but their genes would eventually die off too. You see, if we consider these statistics, that 75% of women can't orgasm with intercourse alone, and men can orgasm whenever they want, then the premise of evolution by natural selection is a perfectly good argument, with virtually no opposition whatsoever. It ties in seamlessly. But if we go under the premise of a loving creator, then what could we possibly say for this phenomenon? Are we to believe that God wants men to orgasm but not women? Well, maybe not all of them, but only some? I mean, you have to go on one heck of a stretch to explain this. Moreover, consider this. There is only one organ in all of humanity that serves no purpose but to bring pleasure: the clitoris. The clitoris serves no purpose whatsoever except to bring pleasure. So are we to believe that God created the clitoris, but for it to dysfunction so profoundly? Yes, examples like this one were popping out all over the place. Science and life itself was screaming evolution by natural selection. It's all around us. Everywhere we turn and everywhere we look, evolution by natural selection can be seen. The writings are all over the wall, in giant letters. In order to simply suggest God, much less accept Him, I had to make assumptions, and often on very long stretches, just to explain things. I didn't know what was left for me. I felt lost. I felt naked. Naked in front of a rush-hour crowd downtown. I would often find myself sitting with my mind simply being blank, overwhelmed with all that I found. There was one thought, however, that was still holding me back from letting go of God. That is, love and morality. How could these two towers of strength come to be without divine intervention? Exhausted and beaten down, I continued my search. At this point, I felt extremely worn out. There was almost nothing left for me to continue to believe in the existence of God, something I held on to so dearly all of my life. As I continued to struggle, I thought, but what about my other argument? The argument of love and morality. This is what I had left. Surely love and morality is not something that could evolve. It simply made no sense. Then one day, while standing in a lineup downtown, a Buddhist lady approached me to spread her message. I thought to myself, lady, you picked the wrong guy. I asked her straight away how she knew that God really existed. Well, her response was unexpected. It was along the very lines of what was causing me not to let go of God yet. She reasoned with me that a human baby is born with love. So where does this love come from? Then, all of a sudden, my mind spoke with a clarity and reasoning that I didn't even know I had. I asked her, is a human baby truly born with love? She quickly replied with, yes, of course. So I argued, a human baby, an even toddler or small child, is entirely self-centered, thinking the world revolves around it. A child refuses to share. A child has virtually no sympathy and no empathy. A very small child can see an animal die and think nothing of it. All of these traits in an adult human would be viewed as an evil person, a psychopath or sociopath. Does that sound like someone with love? Or perhaps they are born with an empty set of neurons, and sympathy and empathy and yes, even love is something that is learned. She was suddenly silent. You could see her questioning my thoughts in her mind. But I didn't stop there. I told her to consider the chimpanzees. They are thought to be the most violent creatures next to humans. Some say even more violent than us. When two tribes meet, they have a war. The victor will then kill all the women and children of the other tribe. But what if we could reason with them and tell Tribe A, you hunt and gather on this side of the water supply, and Tribe B, you hunt and gather on this side of the water supply. Tribe A will take water from the water supply before high noon, and Tribe B after. And then, If you have excess food, you can meet at high noon and exchange goods. It reasons to suggest that they would all get along better and everyone would lead a happier life. It also reasons to suggest that they would eventually start camaraderie and possible social interactions. Who knows, maybe even intertribal relations. Of course, you can't reason with chimpanzees, but with humans you can. You see, if we compare ourselves to these other primates, then something like racism, for example, is a perfectly natural and normal thing, part of our primal selves. But we deny our natural instincts for a more prosperous and peaceful world. Our higher level of reasoning defeats those boundaries which would cause us harm. After much time, we go from tolerating each other, to accepting each other, to embracing and ultimately loving each other. Love is a product of our higher level of reasoning and intellect. It is through our own guidance and training as parents that a human child develops sympathy, compassion, empathy, consideration, and love. My conversation didn't last long with this woman, but after this dialogue, my mind began to really consider and question what love is, and what morality is, and how it has grown in humanity over the years. I began to unravel many things that simply could not be disputed. And while on the topic of racism, consider what not only America but the world was like 150 years ago, and contrast it to the religions of the time. I remember in my theological studies discussing antiquated Christian sermons on this very topic. Yes, the common consensus of the time was that all humans are equal in the eyes of God, but the mixing of the races was very much against God's wishes. And if you look at the arguments these pastors would make, both white and black, and the Bible verses they would use and how they would use them, it was almost like you could begin to believe them. Today, however, this contention would be viewed as morally repulsive and destructive to society, because it is. With the exception of a small faction of extremists, you simply can't find a single church preaching the separation of the races. So then, how did this moral code change within religion if God is always one and the same? Or perhaps God didn't change, but we changed Him according to the evolution of our own moral code. When you look at how races were ever integrated, we see that it was the merchants first, trying to sell products beyond their own countries, looking to make more money, looking for more comfort, in the pursuit of happiness. At this time, various races were interesting to everyone. But through the market of slaves for sale and through continued trade, races were starting to mix more and more. People were getting more and more uncomfortable with this, and our differences caused us to hate. Yet, fast forward many generations, and look where we are. Yes, we still have a long ways to go. But an interracial couple, for example, is not an uncommon thing, and they even put a black man in the White House. You see, it is our continued pursuit of happiness combined with our intellect and higher level of reasoning that brought us to where we are and is continuing to take us where we're going. Religion has changed along with our own moral evolution, not the other way around. We seek happiness and comfort and we follow it. Then we change our perception of God to match this aspiration. Look at the role of women 150 years ago and the religious establishments. Women were considered the weaker sex and of a lower order than men. Even other women believed this. And that is exactly what churches were preaching at the time. And they backed it up with Bible verses. And when you look at the many events that caused all this to change in society over the years, it has nothing to do with religion, but our own quest for happiness. Shrewd politicians, for example, realized that they can win elections by giving women the right to vote. Businessmen realized they could increase their bottom line by having women choose what was purchased outside of food and clothes. Women fought for their rights as equals, and men, eventually, actually began to listen. Men started to realize that their wives are equals. Yes, in this area too, we have a very long road ahead of us, don't get me wrong. But no one can deny we have come such a long ways. And if you comparably look at the churches today, we have female pastors, female elders, and so on. Here again, religion changed with the evolution of our own moral code, and not the other way around. Bible verses that were used to place women beneath men are now twisted and changed in meaning. Some time ago, I took my son to watch the movie Hugo. This story takes place in the early 1930s and was about an orphan boy who lived alone in a railway station in Paris. I recall seeing the scenes where the patrolman would chase after orphans hiding in the train station. and if he caught them, he would say vicious words to them and lock them up until they were taken away to an orphanage. I remember thinking to myself what a horrible time that was. I mean, these actions were real, and orphaned kids really were gathered up and thrown into orphanages. Today, however, if we saw a patrolman so brutally capturing little children and calling them sadistic names, we would all open our phones and call the authorities instantly. Let's consider the trajectory events that took place over the years that brought us from that time to this time. First, kids raised in these orphanages would eventually grow up, and many of them would become criminals, and some the most hardened of criminals. This was a very serious problem for society. Educated people in the social sciences or psychology would come to the conclusion that these orphanages were the cause of so much resentment and anger in these kids, and they needed more personalized time with adults. So for the purpose of a better society, foster homes were invented. People hesitantly brought in these kids into their homes for the sake of making a better world. Well, let's consider what would happen after that. What did happen? The same thing you hear so much of today. The foster parent will say something to the lines of, "This kid is really not so bad, they're just mostly misled. Deep down inside, he's really a good kid. He just needs that loving guidance." And before you know it, the child which was tolerated for the purpose of helping society is now embraced and loved. I watched this movie and realized that here we have yet another example of the evolution of morality and love, the growth of love through our higher level of reasoning and intellect. Consider yet another thought, if we again compare ourselves with other primates. Under this comparison, monogamy is a ludicrous suggestion. Yet again, we defy our natural evolution for the purpose of the pursuit of happiness. We know for a fact, for example, that people who are in long-term committed monogamous relationships live longer, are healthier, have closer bonds with their families, have more money, and the list goes on. And it was religion that held on to polygamy, not just Mormonism. Look it up and you'll see. Examples of the growth or evolution of love and morality is all around us. It's everywhere we look. There is simply no denying it. And throughout all this evolution, it is religion that changed with the times, and never the other way around. In fact, in my study, religions usually attempt to hold back these changes until they finally give in. It was the churches that tried the hardest to stop interracial marriages. It is the churches that tried the hardest to stop the female vote. Research all this on your own, and you'll see that I'm right. Incidentally, it is my opinion that the next big moral change of the world religions will be homosexuality and its acceptance. I strongly believe that when our grandchildren are grown up, we will be able to make the same comparison to churches and homosexuality as we do today with race. Students will say things like, "You know, in my religious studies class, we talked about how people used to think homosexuality was a sin. And if you listen to the way they explained these verses, it was like you could almost believe them." As humans, we're continuously in the pursuit of happiness, and there is nothing that will hold us back to achieve it. Yet so many of us, the majority of the world in fact, hold on to religion, that we're forced to make these changes to tie in with our moral code. The examples are everywhere we look, and everywhere we do look, we see religion changing generation after generation, and we don't see small changes, mind you. These are fundamental and foundational changes. And these fundamental and foundational changes always tie in with the evolution of our moral code of society. Always. This is not in line with a God that is omnipotent and never changes. The religious institutions are a hindrance to morality and growth. The evidence is all around us. All this reasoning had now become indisputable to me. An example I most like to use is from YouTube broadcaster Evidence in his acclaimed documentary, Why I Am No Longer a Christian, where he gives the example of hearing a bump in his closet. If I heard a bump in the closet, I may initially think that it is an animal. However, if I open the door and see a box on the floor that I recalled placing too close to the edge of the shelf, I probably wouldn't think there was an animal anymore. Additionally, when I opened the door, if no animal came running out, and if I looked through the closet carefully and with a flashlight and couldn't find an animal, or any evidence of an animal such as fur or scratch marks, or any evidence that an animal had escaped the closet such as a hole in the wall, I probably for sure wouldn't think there was an animal. In this case, in my mind, there are two opposing explanations. One is that there was an animal and it knocked over the box. The other is that the box fell due to natural processes, like a lack of friction or gravity, or the fact that the shelf was tilted. If I wanted to go on believing that there was an animal that caused the noise, I would have to make assumptions for which I have no evidence for. The simplest answer is the only thing that makes sense. There was no animal. And, after all the findings of my research, if I wanted to go on believing there is a God, I would have to make extreme and fantastic assumptions for which there is no compelling evidence. As some months passed by, all this reasoning slowly revealed itself to me and took a toll on me. I mentioned before that a depression was looming. Well, now a full-fledged depression had sunk in. I suddenly realized that I had no motivating evidence of any kind whatsoever to explain God. I had no reason to motivate me to believe that. I now realized that there is no God. A very strong depression sunk in, a feeling of emptiness, a feeling of being lost without any direction to find myself, a profound sense of loss, the loss of the blessed assurance, the loss of life after death, the loss of being loved by a Holy Father and never being alone. And I felt so alone and so lost. There was literally nothing I could do to hold on any longer. I realized things like prayer were rituals that disconnected me with reality. The belief that God can fix all problems was another disconnect from reality. As I contemplated the depression that sunk in, I started to realize the true reason of why I always held on so dearly. I realized that I didn't want to let go of life after death. I didn't want to accept that I will simply die. I didn't want to let go of the blessed assurance and my great protection. With all the crazy things taking place in this world, what if I fell to ill doings? What if some street thugs robbed me and shot me? What if I got into a car accident and died, or paralyzed? What if I became dreadfully sick? This all caused me great despair and hopelessness. I had nowhere left to look. I now continued life with a sense of fear, a sense of misdirection, and a profound sense of loss. Remarkably, I started to slowly grow out of depression and into a new sense of being and existence. I call this my spiritual awakening. It is incredible how time will heal all wounds, even ones so profound, overpowering, and overwhelming. But time did just that. I began to awaken with a new and more beautiful acceptance of reality and humanity. Sure, I question my consciousness from time to time, and if it is something more than simply neurons firing electrical impulses. Was there something greater out there after all? I even pondered the idea that maybe something created the first life form, and that evolution by natural selection was the result. I still have these questions and remain staunch that the only true answer is that we don't know. But as the acceptance of our mortality sinks in, and the prospect of life after death being nothing more than a philosophical question, the beauty of humanity becomes much more apparent. As I awoke from the depression to a beautiful new day, I embraced reality. I embraced all humanity like I had never done before. Every glance from another human being's eyes, every breath, every movement was a thing of wonderment and beauty. The importance of family and friendship was more fervent than it had ever been. The importance of doing my best and leaving a better world behind for those that will continue on long after I'm gone was a thing of imperative value. Furthermore, life, the earth, and the universe had become more beautiful than ever imagined. The universe is a thing of great mystery and beauty, an infinite reality to be explored. Life was a beautiful thing, and the possibility of there being more life out there was an exciting and stunning reality I wanted to explore. I was not only compatible with the mysterious reality of the universe, but I was a very part of the great nature of the universe. The universe is inexplicable and secretive, and I was thrilled to explore it. Reality was the life and world that I was part of now, and I could hardly wait to see what else it would bring me. The more and more my spiritual awakening was clearing my mind and opening my eyes and showing me the mysteries of the universe with clarity, and the more and more I looked at the beauty of the universe and all its secrets with awe and inspiration, the more I despised theism, the belief in the one deity, the one God. Theism disallowed me from opening my eyes and seeing reality. It prohibited me from exploring the great unknowns with its fix-all, God is the answer to absolutely everything model. In my entire life until now, I have never questioned my beliefs. I never questioned what's out there and what's the meaning to everything. I now saw that I was deceived by theism. I was deceived from exploring these thoughts by being told that God is the answer to everything, or that God will one day show me all the answers of life, love, and the universe. I was deceived by theism, which now showed me its ugly side. To quote evidence once again, this theistic God was an ugly force which demanded to be glorified. It demanded its will with an ironclad fist. It had been built and fed over the years by the Christian imagination that heaped to their greatest fears and most bigoted opinions upon it until it took on a life of its own. This God sent homosexuals to hell because it detested their actions. You are not worthy of Him. Your understanding is inferior and your logic is flawed. So He is your only redemption. And you better believe every word in the Bible, like it or not, because those words are His. If you didn't, He would fan the flames of hell in preparation for you. He had already given you a chance. He had stated very clearly that Jesus was the only way. But you wouldn't listen. His will is divine. His guidance was perfect and perfectly clear. If you didn't know His guidance, it was your fault. You had to fix your sinful life. You had to separate yourself from the world through prayer and beg for forgiveness of that sin, because you are pitiful and so unworthy and so lost without Him. The construct of theistic religion had now become an unsightly and repulsive organization. At one time I used to defend religion, saying that all the destructive aspects of religion were people that misused it or misinterpreted it. Now I see the truth for what it really is. It is a suppression of free thought. It is a control of the masses. It instills fear. It is the hindrance and restraint of progress. It is the repression of that which is detested by its followers, such as homosexuality. It is the cause of so much suffering and so much war. With my newfound truths, I rushed to tell people of my discoveries, but my response was a big surprise. I was greeted with anger and even hate. I was told that I would burn in hell or that I will never see my mother again. I was insulted by people telling me that no longer believing in God or being an atheist was a religion of its own. Everyone was so defensive, as though I was attacking them. I tried so hard to explain that I was not trying to fight a battle, but rather that this was something I simply now believed. But it fell to deaf ears. The religious world was convinced that I was trying to fight them over beliefs, and that my not believing in God anymore was a religion of its own, like not collecting stamps was a hobby, or not smoking was a habit. With my closest friends, I got a much kinder response, but it was just as surprising. As I said in the beginning of this movie, my closest friends, or as I like to refer to them, my brothers, wished I never had such a negative experience with church and that I never swayed. I tried fervently to explain that I have no ill feelings towards church, and there is nothing of a negative experience to account for, and that this is simply what I now believe. And yet again, it fell on deaf ears. As far as they were concerned, I had left the church because of harmful and destructive experiences, and that now I was rebelling against the institution. I found that no matter what the line of reasoning, people simply won't let go of this idea of God, much like I was in the past. We are said to be the only animals that are conscious of our mortality. Well, I heard that it was the same with dolphins and chimps, but I don't know about that. But we are animals that are conscious of our mortality. In other words, we know we're going to die. You see, my cat is 14 years old, and she doesn't have a lot of years left on this world. But she doesn't stay up at night stressing about this issue because she doesn't actually know she's going to die. We, however, do. And this, for a species with so much reasoning and love, is a very difficult thing to accept. It is a horrible thought that we will grow older and older, more and more frail, and then simply cease to exist. What makes this an even harder thought to accept is that most of us are continually struggling to create a better life for ourselves, having such difficulties making ends meet, continuously working, and being tired with so little time for enjoyment. Life is so unfair in so many ways. We're also a species that always makes mistakes, and many of the mistakes we make cause irreparable damage to the enjoyment of our lives. With so much reasoning, with so much love, and with so much struggle, to accept that there is nothing more after death can be overwhelming, overpowering, devastating, crushing. To accept this admission is most times unbearable and insufferable, a thought so horrendous that we simply are unable to tolerate it. So we created God, a calm after the storm, a force of refuge from the ills of life. We created a place where we can live again, where we can play with our children again, pet our animals again, renew friendships, enjoy again, and love again. As far as I'm concerned, this is why people simply refuse to let go. It helps them continue their lives. But I have wonderful news. These feelings of despair and despondency fade away when reality is accepted. A new beauty of life and the universe come to be. A profound sense of love, of humanity, empowers one's life and brings them so much happiness. I know this is so hard to believe. The loss of the blessed assurance is an acute pain, leaving a person with such intense emptiness. I have been there, and today I am happier than I have ever been. I once had a heated discussion over all this with a very intelligent young person who asked me what meaning is there to life when you take out God. He suggested that I had an illusionary view to the meaning of life, and that being an atheist is unbelievable. I rebutted by telling him that we are human beings, and as such we love our children, we love ourselves, we love each other, we love our world, we love our existence. I told him that it was amazing to me that the people who most strongly contend that they have a grasp of the understanding of love, Christians, are the first to dismiss it as giving our lives any meaning. I went on to say that because one cannot admit to reality and therefore holds on to a magic man in the sky, this was what was truly illusionary. If there is anything that's unbelievable, it's the entire concept of God.
You're unbelievable. You're so unbelievable. You're unbelievable. You're unbelievable.